In the middle of a forgotten park, a little girl approaches Ethan and says something that leaves him speechless. "I know you. My mom carries your photo in her wallet." Unsure of what it means, Ethan begins to realize that his past is about to resurface in ways he never expected. Ethan Mitchell stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, overlooking the sprawling city below. From this vantage point, the world appeared within his grasp. A world he had conquered through years of hard work, ruthless decision-making, and an unrelenting drive for success. At 42, Ethan had everything he had ever dreamed of. A thriving construction business, a multi-million-dollar fortune, and a home that screamed luxury in every corner. But as he gazed out at the skyline, that familiar emptiness gnawed at him. No matter how much he achieved, no matter how high he climbed, something was always missing. He tried to brush it off, as he had countless times before. After all, who was he to complain? Most people would kill to live in a place like this. Yet, deep down, Ethan knew the truth. His success had come at a cost he wasn't willing to acknowledge. It was a Sunday morning, and the penthouse was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Ethan wandered through his impeccably designed living room, the silence amplifying his thoughts. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to a time when things were simpler. He hadn't thought of those days in years. Not since the falling out with his sister Sarah over a decade ago. They had been close once, inseparable even. But that was before the arguments, the betrayal, and the long stretch of silence that followed. Ethan shook his head, refusing to dwell on the past. He had built his life by looking forward, not backward. But today, something felt different. A restlessness had settled in his chest, and without thinking, Ethan grabbed his coat and left his apartment. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but his feet seemed to know. A few hours later, he found himself in a part of Brooklyn he hadn't visited in years. His old neighborhood had changed. There were new shops, new faces, and an unfamiliar air of gentrification. But as Ethan walked down the familiar streets, memories began to flood back. He didn't know why he had come here, but there was something almost magnetic pulling him toward the past he had tried so hard to forget. Eventually, his steps led him to a small, dilapidated park. It was the same park he and Sarah had played in as kids. Ethan stood at the entrance, staring at the rusty swing sets and overgrown grass. The place was a shadow of what it had once been, a far cry from the vibrant, lively spot where they had spent countless afternoons together. Seeing the park in this state stirred something inside Ethan, a mix of nostalgia and regret. As he walked deeper into the park, he noticed a few children playing in the distance, their laughter faint against the quiet stillness of the afternoon. He was about to turn back when a little girl, no older than 10, approached him. She had a curious look in her eyes, her blonde curls bouncing as she ran up to him. "Hey, I know you," she said, her voice full of innocence and certainty. Ethan blinked, taken aback by the sudden encounter. "You do?" he asked, confused. He didn't recognize the girl at all. "Yeah," she replied, tilting her head to the side. "I've seen your picture before. My mom keeps it in her wallet." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. Her mom? Who could this girl be? The last thing he expected was for a stranger to recognize him, especially from a picture carried by someone's mother. He knelt down to meet her eye level. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Emily," she said with a bright smile. "My mom's name is Sarah." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. Sarah, it couldn't be. He hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in so long, and hearing it now from the lips of this little girl sent a wave of emotions crashing over him. Emily. This girl, this innocent child, was his niece. But she didn't know. Of course she didn't know. How could she? Ethan had cut Sarah out of his life so completely that even the thought of having a niece hadn't crossed his mind. His hands felt clammy as he stood back up, his mind reeling. How had things gotten so bad? How had they let a decade go by without so much as a word between them? "Your mom? Does she talk about me?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual, though his heart was racing. Emily shrugged. "Sometimes, but she doesn't say much. Just that you were really close once, and that you live far away now." She paused, looking at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Why don't you visit her?" Ethan's throat tightened. What could he possibly say to that? How could he explain to this little girl the complexity of adult relationships, the weight of pride, and the burden of regret? He forced a smile. "Things are complicated, Emily," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Emily studied him for a moment, as if sensing there was more to the story. "Well, you should visit her. I think she misses you." Her words lingered in the air, simple but powerful. Ethan looked down at the little girl standing before him, and in her eyes, he saw Sarah, his sister, the only family he had left, and yet she had felt like a stranger for so long. "I'll think about it," he said finally, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew that wasn't enough. He had to do more than just think about it. As Emily ran off to join the other kids, Ethan stood alone in the empty park, the weight of his past pressing down on him. How had he let things get to this point? He had always been so focused on moving forward, on building his business, on making something of himself. But in doing so, he had left behind the people who mattered most. For years, he had justified the distance between him and Sarah, telling himself that they were better off apart. The argument they had all those years ago had been the breaking point. About money, about pride, about things that felt so important at the time, but now seemed trivial in comparison to the lost time. But standing in this park where their childhood memories lingered like ghosts, Ethan realized just how much he had missed. He had missed watching his niece grow up. He had missed the chance to be there for his sister during the hard times. And for what? For a business. For success that felt hollow when there was no one to share it with. Ethan took a deep breath, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and determination. He had to see Sarah. He had to make things right, or at least try. Before it was too late. Ethan stood at the entrance of the old park long after Emily had run off to rejoin the other children. His mind was swirling with memories and emotions he had long buried. The name Sarah echoed in his thoughts louder with each passing second. Emily's innocent question, "Why don't you visit her?" kept repeating itself. And Ethan felt a pang of guilt that was hard to shake. He had lived with that guilt for years, but he had always managed to drown it out with work, with deals, with distractions. Now, standing in this park where he and Sarah used to play as kids, there was no escaping it. The memories here were too strong, too vivid. He could still see their younger selves running through the grass, swinging on the rusty swings that now sat unused and abandoned. They used to dream of the future together, back when nothing seemed more important than family. But that was before the falling out, before they had gone their separate ways, leaving a chasm between them that had only grown with time. Ethan hadn't seen Sarah in over 10 years, and truthfully, he hadn't thought much about her until today. The fight they had had back then felt like it happened in a different lifetime. But now, standing in this place filled with the ghosts of their past, Ethan wondered how he had let things go so wrong. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily. She was his niece, his own flesh and blood, and yet he had never even known she existed until today. Sarah had kept her from him, whether out of anger or self-preservation. Ethan wasn't sure. Either way, it hurt, and the fact that Emily didn't even know who he was, that she only knew him as a face in a photograph her mother kept in her wallet, made that hurt even deeper. There was no denying it. Ethan had to see Sarah. It wasn't just about the past anymore, it was about the future. Emily had given him an opportunity, a glimpse of what he had missed all these years, and he wasn't going to waste it. With a renewed sense of determination, Ethan left the park and walked through the familiar streets of Brooklyn, toward the small house he knew Sarah had moved into after everything fell apart. It was a far cry from the lavish penthouse he now called home. But Ethan knew it was all she could afford after their fallout. He had heard from distant relatives that Sarah was struggling financially, but he had never reached out to help, too consumed by his own pride to offer her anything. The neighborhood had changed over the years. What was once a bustling area filled with life now seemed quieter, more rundown. The houses were older, many of them in disrepair, and the sense of community Ethan remembered from his childhood seemed to have faded. But as he approached Sarah's house, his heart raced. What would he say to her? How could he even begin to make up for the years they had lost? The house was modest, a small single-story building with peeling paint and an overgrown front yard. Ethan hesitated for a moment at the gate, his hand trembling as he reached for the latch. He hadn't been this nervous in years, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal or a negotiation. This was his family, and there was no price tag, no contract that could fix what he had broken. As he stood there gathering the courage to knock, the door suddenly opened. Standing in the doorway was Sarah. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. She looked older than he remembered, with lines of wear and exhaustion etched into her face. But despite the years that had passed, she was still his sister, and seeing her standing there just a few feet away made the wall he had built around himself start to crumble. "Ethan," Sarah's voice was filled with surprise, and for a moment she just stared at him, as if unsure whether to believe he was really there. "Sarah," Ethan managed to say, his voice hoarse. I came to see you." Her expression hardened, the warmth of their childhood connection quickly replaced by the bitterness of old wounds. She stepped out onto the porch, crossing her arms as she looked at him with a guarded gaze. "I didn't expect to ever see you again," Sarah said, her voice cold. "What are you doing here?" Ethan swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. How could he explain a decade of silence? How could he justify abandoning his only sister when she needed him the most? I ran into Emily," Ethan said, his voice low. "She didn't know who I was, Sarah. She only recognized me from a photo you carry. Why didn't you tell her about me?" Sarah's eyes flickered with pain, but she quickly masked it with anger. "Why would I, Ethan? You walked out on us, on me. You made it clear that your business, your money was more important than family. What was I supposed to say to her? That her uncle was too busy to care about us?" Her words cut deep, and Ethan felt a wave of shame wash over him. She was right. He had left, and he hadn't looked back. He had been too wrapped up in his own ambitions to think about the people he had hurt along the way. "I know I messed up," Ethan admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know I haven't been there for you or for Emily. But I'm here now. I want to fix this, Sarah. I want to make things right." Sarah let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Fix this? Ethan, you can't just walk back into my life after 10 years and think you can fix everything with a few words. It doesn't work like that." "I'm not expecting you to forgive me right away," Ethan said quickly, "but I want to try. Please, let me try." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether he was sincere. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I don't know, Ethan," she said softly. "It's been a long time. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Stay tuned for more, because things are just getting started." Sarah's words hung in the air like a cold mist, enveloping them both in the weight of the past. Ethan could see the hurt in her eyes, the walls she had built around herself, and he realized that this wouldn't be easy. He had spent too many years avoiding the hard truths. And now, standing on his sister's porch, he was faced with all the consequences of his choices. Sarah had every right to be angry. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and no amount of wealth or success could undo the damage he had caused. "I know it's been a long time," Ethan said softly, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity he hadn't felt in years. "But I'm here now, and I want to try. I want to be part of your life again, and part of Emily's." At the mention of her daughter, Sarah's expression softened, if only slightly. Emily was everything to her, the one bright spot in a world that had often felt cold and unforgiving. Sarah had raised her alone without any help from Ethan or anyone else, and she had done her best to shield Emily from the pain of her family's fractured past. But deep down, Sarah knew that Emily was curious about her uncle, about the family she had never known. And now, with Ethan standing in front of her, a small part of her wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of the anger that had held her captive for so long. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Ethan continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want a chance to make things right, to prove that I've changed." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. She had heard promises before, promises from people who had let her down, abandoned her, and left her to pick up the pieces. But something in Ethan's voice, in the way he stood before her with such vulnerability, made her hesitate. Emily, she's been asking about you, Sarah admitted quietly, almost as if she didn't want to say it out loud. She's seen that picture in my wallet for years, and I've told her about you. But I never wanted her to know the full story. I didn't want her to grow up hating you the way I did. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. The thought of Emily growing up without knowing him, without even knowing the reasons behind their family's rift, filled him with regret. He had missed so much. Birthdays, holidays, moments he could never get back. And now the reality of that loss was hitting him harder than he had expected. I don't want her to hate me, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. And I don't want you to hate me either, Sarah. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I've been sorry for a long time, but I didn't know how to come back. I didn't know how to fix what I'd broken. Sarah let out a long, slow breath, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. For years, she had carried the weight of her anger, the bitterness of being abandoned by her only brother. She had built her life without him, raising Emily on her own, and never once asking for his help. But now, seeing him here, broken and vulnerable, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go. Maybe it's too late for us, Sarah said, her voice quiet but steady. But for Emily's sake, I'm willing to give you a chance. She deserves to know her family, and if you really mean what you say, then maybe we can figure this out. But it's going to take time, Ethan, a lot of time. Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. He knew this wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. I'll take whatever time it takes, he promised. I just want the chance to make things right. Sarah nodded, her arms still crossed protectively over her chest. You can start by spending some time with Emily. She's been asking about you, and I think it's only fair that you get to know her on her terms. Ethan's heart lifted at the thought of reconnecting with his niece. He had missed so much already, but maybe, just maybe, there was still time to build something meaningful with her. And maybe, through Emily, he could start to rebuild his relationship with Sarah as well. I'd love that, Ethan said. I'd really love that. Sarah glanced toward the house, her expression softening slightly. She's inside. Why don't you come in and say hello? Ethan hesitated for a moment, his pulse quickening at the thought of finally meeting his niece properly. He had seen her in the park, of course, but that brief encounter had been filled with confusion and shock. Now he was about to meet her as her uncle, a role he had long neglected but was desperate to fulfill. Taking a deep breath, Ethan followed Sarah into the house. The inside was modest but clean and warm, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile luxury of his penthouse. As they entered the living room, Ethan's eyes were drawn to the family photos that lined the walls. Pictures of Emily growing up, of Sarah holding her as a baby, of moments Ethan had never been part of. It was a harsh reminder of all he had missed, but it also fueled his determination to be part of their lives moving forward. Emily? Sarah called softly, her voice carrying through the small house. There's someone here to see you. A moment later, Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Ethan standing there. For a brief moment, she looked between him and her mother, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. Hi, Ethan said, his voice gentle. We met earlier, but I didn't get to introduce myself properly. I'm your uncle. Emily's eyes flickered with curiosity, and she took a tentative step forward. My, uncle? Ethan nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. Yeah, I've been away for a while, but I'd like to get to know you, if that's okay with you. Emily looked up at her mother for reassurance, and Sarah gave her a small nod. Slowly, Emily turned back to Ethan, a shy smile forming on her face. I guess that's okay, she said softly. I've always wondered what you were like. Ethan felt his heart swell with emotion. This was his chance to start over, to build something new with his niece, and hopefully with his sister as well. I'll make it up to you, Ethan promised, his voice filled with conviction. I'll make up for all the time we've lost. Sarah stood silently in the background, watching the exchange between her brother and her daughter. For the first time in years, there was a flicker of hope in her heart, a hope that maybe, just maybe, their family could heal. But as Ethan began to reconnect with Emily, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't done with them yet. There were still things left unsaid, secrets that hadn't been revealed. And as much as she wanted to believe in a fresh start, Sarah knew that their journey to healing was far from over. Over the next few weeks, Ethan made a point to visit Sarah and Emily whenever his busy schedule allowed. The visits were tentative at first, short, awkward exchanges where both he and Sarah danced around the deeper issues that still lingered between them. But Emily, with her bright curiosity and infectious energy, seemed to bridge the gap between them. She didn't care about the tension or the years that had passed. To her, Ethan was simply her uncle, and she wanted to know everything about him. "Why did you go away for so long?" Emily asked one afternoon as they sat on the front porch watching the neighborhood children play in the street. Her question was innocent, but it hit Ethan like a blow to the chest. He hesitated, unsure of how much to say. How could he explain the complicated relationship between him and Sarah, the bitterness and resentment that had driven them apart? How could he tell a 10-year-old about the pride and ambition that had caused him to prioritize his career over his family? "I had work," Ethan said finally, feeling the inadequacy of his answer. "And sometimes when you're focused on work, you lose sight of what's really important." Emily looked at him with wide, inquisitive eyes, waiting for more. Ethan smiled sadly. "I made mistakes," he added, glancing briefly at Sarah, who was listening from the kitchen window. "Big mistakes. But I'm trying to make things right now." Emily nodded, accepting his answer with the simplicity of a child who didn't yet understand the complexity of adult relationships. She leaned her head against his arm, and Ethan felt a rush of affection for his niece. In just a few short weeks, she had managed to worm her way into his heart, filling a void he hadn't even realized was there. But as much as Ethan cherished his growing bond with Emily, he couldn't ignore the unresolved tension with Sarah. Every conversation with her felt like walking on eggshells. And though she had softened slightly toward him, Ethan knew there was still something she wasn't telling him, something that kept her from fully trusting him again. One evening after Emily had gone to bed, Ethan stayed behind to talk to Sarah. They sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "Sarah," Ethan began cautiously, "I feel like there's still a lot we haven't talked about. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But if we're going to move forward, I think we need to be honest with each other." Sarah looked away, her jaw tightening. "There's nothing more to say, Ethan," she said, her voice clipped. "You left. You chose your career over your family. What more is there to talk about?" Ethan's chest tightened with frustration. "That's not fair, Sarah. You make it sound like I just walked away for no reason. But you know it was more complicated than that." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, it was complicated, all right. You were so obsessed with building your company, with proving to everyone how successful you could be, that you didn't care about anything else. Not even when I needed you the most." Ethan frowned, confused by the sudden sharpness in her tone. "What are you talking about?" For a moment, Sarah said nothing, her face a mask of anger and pain. Then, slowly, she stood up and walked over to the small bookshelf in the corner of the room. She pulled out a worn, faded photo album and handed it to Ethan without a word. Ethan opened the album, his eyes scanning the photos of their childhood, of their parents, of the times before everything had fallen apart. But as he turned the pages, something caught his eye. Photos of Sarah, pregnant and alone. There were pictures of a hospital room, of a baby wrapped in a pink blanket, of Sarah cradling a newborn in her arms. "Emily." Ethan looked up at Sarah, his heart racing. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. But she quickly wiped them away, her expression hardening. "Because you weren't there, Ethan. I tried to tell you. I called, I sent messages. But you were too busy with your business, too busy traveling and making deals to care about what was happening here. After a while, I stopped trying." Ethan felt like the floor had fallen out from beneath him. He had missed everything. Emily's birth, her first steps, her first words. He had been so consumed by his ambition that he hadn't even known his own sister was going through one of the most important moments of her life. "I didn't know," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "If I had known—" "But you didn't know," Sarah cut in sharply. "Because you didn't bother to check in. You didn't bother to come home. You were too busy building your empire to care about your family." Sheriff, Ethan bowed his head, the weight of her words crashing down on him. She was right. He had been so focused on his career, on proving himself to the world, that he had forgotten the people who had always been there for him. And now, seeing the evidence of what he had missed, the birth of his niece, the life that Sarah had built without him, it was almost too much to bear. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't know. I should have been there. I should have." Sarah's anger seemed to deflate at the sight of her brother's tears. She sank down onto the couch beside him, her voice softening. "I know you didn't know," she said quietly, "but it doesn't change the fact that you weren't there. And I had to raise Emily on my own." Ethan wiped at his eyes, his heart heavy with regret. "I want to be there now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can't make up for the past, but I want to be part of your lives. I want to be a good uncle to Emily, and I want to be your brother again." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "It's not going to be easy, Ethan," she warned. "There's a lot of hurt here, a lot of things we can't just sweep under the rug." "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Sarah looked down at the photo album in Ethan's lap, her expression softening slightly. "Maybe it's time we start over," she said quietly, "for Emily's sake and for ours." Ethan nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. "I'd like that," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I'd really like that." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the past still heavy between them, but with the first signs of healing beginning to emerge. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. It was a small, tentative step toward reconciliation. But for Ethan, it was the most important step he had taken in years. The weeks following Ethan's revelation were filled with tentative steps toward healing. The weight of the years they had lost still lingered between him and Sarah, but there was something different now, a willingness to try. And it was Emily, with her innocent love and unfiltered excitement, who seemed to be the glue that held them together. Ethan found himself spending more and more time in Brooklyn. What had started as short, careful visits had grown into long afternoons, helping Sarah around the house, playing with Emily, and to his own surprise, getting involved in the park restoration project. The park had been a forgotten relic of his childhood, a place that once held so many memories for him and Sarah. Now it was becoming a symbol of their reconciliation, a shared effort to rebuild something that had been neglected for far too long. Ethan poured not just money into the project, but his time and effort as well. He worked alongside the other volunteers, getting his hands dirty, talking to the neighbors he had long since forgotten, and reconnecting with the community he had left behind. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the deals and contracts that had once consumed his life. One afternoon, as they worked on clearing debris from the playground, Sarah approached him, wiping sweat from her brow. She watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Ethan looked up, smiling at his sister. "I am," he said simply. "I spent so long thinking that success meant having more money, more power, more recognition. But none of that matters if you don't have anyone to share it with. This," he gestured to the park around them, the people working together to restore it. "This feels like something real, something that matters." Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's good to see you like this. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you're here, Ethan." He paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. For years, he had carried the guilt of leaving her behind, of abandoning his family in pursuit of a dream that had ultimately left him feeling empty. But now, standing here, covered in dirt and sweat, surrounded by people who cared about more than just profit margins, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. "Thanks, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." As the weeks went by, the park slowly began to take shape. The swings were repaired, new playground equipment was installed, and the overgrown grass was trimmed back to reveal the open spaces where children could once again run and play. The community came together in a way that Ethan hadn't seen in years, and he realized that it wasn't just the park that was being restored. it was his family too. The day of the park's grand reopening arrived, and the neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. Ethan stood by the entrance, watching as families poured in, children laughing and running toward the newly restored playground. He spotted Emily in the crowd, her blonde curls bouncing as she played with a group of kids, her laughter ringing out over the noise of the gathering. Sarah joined him a moment later, a proud smile on her face. "I can't believe we actually did it," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "The park looks amazing." "It does," Ethan agreed. But as he watched Emily play, he realized that it wasn't just the park he was proud of. It was the journey they had taken to get here. The park had been a symbol of their fractured past, a reminder of all the years they had lost. But now it was a testament to their ability to rebuild, to forgive, and to start over. As the event kicked off, the community leaders took turns making speeches, thanking the volunteers who had made the restoration possible. Finally, it was Ethan's turn to speak. He had never been one for public speeches, but as he stepped up to the microphone, he felt a strange sense of calm. "I want to thank everyone who helped make this project a reality," Ethan began, his voice steady. "This park holds a lot of memories for me and my family, and seeing it come back to life has been a personal journey as much as a community effort." He paused, glancing at Sarah, who stood near the front of the crowd, watching him with a mixture of pride and emotion. "For a long time, I thought success was something you could measure in money or accomplishments. But what I've learned is that real success is about the connections you have with the people who matter. It's about family, community, and giving back to the places that shaped you." Ethan's voice wavered slightly as he continued, his eyes locking with Sarah's. "I made a lot of mistakes. I let my ambition take me away from the people who needed me most. But today, standing here, I want to thank my sister Sarah for giving me a second chance, for letting me be part of her life, and for reminding me what's really important." The crowd was silent for a moment, and then a wave of applause broke out. Ethan stepped away from the microphone, his heart pounding with emotion. As he walked towards Sarah, he could see tears in her eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt like they had truly found their way back to each other. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," Sarah said softly as he approached. "I never thought we'd get here, but I'm glad we did." Ethan smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they stood there, surrounded by the laughter and joy of the community, Ethan realized that this was the life he had been searching for all along. Not the empty material success he had chased for so long, but a life filled with love, purpose, and connection. Later that evening, after the park had emptied out and the excitement of the day had quieted down, Ethan sat on a bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emily ran over to him, her cheeks flushed from playing all day. "Uncle Ethan, come look at the swings," she called, her voice filled with excitement. "They're just like you said they used to be." Ethan smiled, standing up and following her to the swings, where he pushed her gently, her laughter filling the air. As he watched her soar higher and higher, Ethan felt a deep sense of contentment. He had spent so many years searching for something he thought he could only find in boardrooms and skyscrapers. But in the end, it was here, in the laughter of his niece, in the forgiveness of his sister, and in the simple joy of a restored park, that Ethan had finally found what he was looking for. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future content. Join us for more inspiring stories that remind us of the power of family, community, and second chances.